can do a handheld if it's better. Hold on, I gotta change clothes. Give me a second. This one was uncomfortable. Oh man. All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, I had the benefit of Jude dressing me with this the first time, so if it's a little sloppier, I apologize. All right, so this is an incredible story, one that I think probably feels all too familiar to some of you in this room, to this church. As I was praying for you, this is absolutely the word that I felt like God dropped into my spirit, and he showed me here in 1 Kings chapter 17, and he showed me again in Upper Room in the ending chapters of the book of John through the beginning chapters of the book of Acts. And so, as I was getting this, a question came to me. Okay, Lord, I'll say that. What in the world's an upper room? I don't know what an upper room is, so I had to look it up. Because I thought, if you want me to talk about the upper room, by the way, that's the title of our message today, I'd better know what I'm talking about. And so I looked, and in ancient times, you know, homes were a little more meager than they are in modern America in 2023. And so they would build small houses, and then on top of the roof, they would build an addition, what we would probably call a bonus room. Only this bonus room was tiny. It could basically fit like a mat rolled out. So if you had a visitor, they would stay in this upper room. But in Israel, the reason they built these upper rooms, and they made them kind of a multifunctional room, was because that was the place they believed they could get closest to God. So when they needed to exhort him, when they needed the power of God to move in their life, they moved their prayer room upstairs into this upper room. I believe this is where Elijah was staying. And so, the upper room is a dwelling place. That's our first point. The upper room is a dwelling place. But Brother Nathan, we don't have upper rooms in our homes today. We're not building these facilities on top of the roof. I know people have upstairs, but we don't use a multi-function room, or at least I never have. I've never seen one that's built specifically to bring God's power into our life. And so, what is our dwelling place? That was the first thing I had to get clarity from. And the Lord said, we have to make a dwelling place of prayer. We don't just need a room. We don't need a physical room. We need a spiritual room in our life that is our place where we go to dwell in prayer when we have a deep need. It's our place that we go when we say, Lord, I've got to have you move in this situation, because if you don't move, nothing's going to change. And I can tell you, I didn't see faces clearly, but the Lord said to me, there's people that have been in a dwelling place of prayer for a long time. And I've got a word for them today. And this is the word. So then I said, okay, Lord, what drives us to our upper room? And the first thing that drives us to our upper room is another D. The first D is disappointment. The first thing that drives us to the upper room of prayer, to our spiritual dwelling place, is disappointment. Has anyone ever experienced disappointment in their life? Has anyone ever experienced disappointment in this church? You know, 17 years ago, I remember there were exactly 121 people in this sanctuary. And Destiny Aran and Canaan Aran were holding up signs, way to go. My Aunt Debbie, who's no longer with us, was here visiting. And I remember she couldn't sit down. I'm sure the person behind her thought, could you just get out of the way? We want to see too. And I remember we had kids off on the other side, and I thought, man, I've never seen anything like this in a place the size of Kentucky. We're busting at the seams. And I believe that I thought, and many of you thought, that would just go on forever and ever. When Elijah showed up at this woman's house, he showed up and God had showed her, you're going to feed this man, only she didn't have any food left. So when Elijah got there, he said, what do you have, woman? Make me something out of it. And she said, I just have a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil. And he said, well, if you'll make me a cake, then you can feed you and your son, and we're just going to keep eating forever and ever like that. Now, mind you, Elijah had called a drought down in Israel, and so there was no food. So she thought, hey, this could just go on like this forever. Have we ever been somewhere and we thought, we're right in the center of God's will, and we can just go on forever and ever like this? And then things change. God, I'm doing everything you called me to do. I still show up. I still pay my tithe. I still shake hands. I'm still greeting people, and yet things have changed. God, I feel so disappointed. You sent the man of God to me to sustain my son, and now my son's gone. Why did you do that, Lord? I'm going to tell you about another upper room. I said that the other place that God showed me was in the book of John. Is in John chapter 13. Jesus calls them to the upper room. They also, the disciples thought they were right in the middle of the Lord's will. They had their Messiah as their rabbi, and he was healing and teaching, and they were traveling the countryside, and he was becoming famouser even than the Beatles at that point. And they thought this could just go on forever and ever. And that very week, he rode into Jerusalem on a colt of a donkey, and he continued to fulfill prophecy. And people were waving palm branches, saying, "This is the day the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it, for our King has come. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And they thought, we're finally following a king to a throne. And they got to the upper room, and Jesus said, "One of you is about to betray me. And this week, at the end of this week, I'm going to die." I can tell you that was pretty disappointing. The widow of Zarephath, the Sidonian woman, the Gentile that Elijah had come to rescue, she and her son, they were incredibly disappointed at this point. Some of you have faced incredible disappointment. Every time you've watched a member say, "I'll see you next Sunday," and they never show back up. Every time a visitor comes through the door and you send them a letter and you're eager and you think, "Hey, we've got another family to help us in this fight," and they never come back, you've experienced disappointment. Disappointment drives us to the dwelling place of prayer. Number 2 is death. Jesus didn't just tell him he was going away. He told him, "I'm going to die. And one of you are going to be responsible for it." I can tell you, death drives us to the dwelling place of prayer. What happened to this Sidonian woman's son? He didn't just get sick. He died. And she thought, "Lord, the only reason I need food was to keep my son alive." You know how I know she thought that? Because I've got 4 children now. And if I had to miss a meal, that's fine with me. If they had to miss a meal, that's not okay. I'll figure it out. I'll get them food. And then the son died, and she thought, "Well, Lord, why would you even send the man of God? If the thing I love the most was just going to die on his watch, you might as well not send him at all, because I'm ready to go. I don't need to be here." Sometimes our dreams die. Has anyone ever faced a moment where they thought, "Lord, I had a dream for something great. I thought I had a ministry that was going to blossom and bloom." I can tell you, I have spent my adult life trying to be an author. And every time I get a rejection, a little bit of that dream dies. My wife keeps saying, "Hold on, there's going to be someone that sees your work, and it's going to be the next thing." I think, I don't know. Sometimes it just feels like it's dead and gone, because everything else in my life is reality, and that's not reality. That's going nowhere. I can tell you, when I spoke to the board, one of the board members told me at this time last year, was ready to call it quits. My dream for this church was dead. And I thought, if you guys want to keep this going, you're crazy. When things that we love die, they send us to the dwelling place of prayer. Then we get desperate. I think that's our 4th D. We get desperate. What did the disciples do? "Lord, you're not going to die. Peter, I won't let you die. I would never betray you. I'll be right here by your side forever." To the point that at one point Jesus said to him, "Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're making this harder than it has to be. I'm going to die." Like, come on now. Peter was willing to fight for him when the garrison of soldiers showed up in the garden. He took out a sword and chopped off an ear. This is a message for a different day, but Jesus began covering our sin at that very moment when he picked an ear up and put it on the face of that Roman soldier. Where was the evidence of his guilt? The same place the evidence of my guilt is. It's gone, because Jesus covers it. But at some point we have to get desperate. This Sidonian woman was desperate. Elijah, what did you come to do? To reveal all my sin? To remind me of what a bad, awful woman I've been? To take the thing that I love the most away from me? Is that why you're here? I had faith. I believed. I trusted in you. I believe the disciples went through this moment where they thought, Lord, it can't be. Jesus himself had to go into the garden place, and he was praying so fervently and so desperately that he began to sweat blood. I've had some real desperate moments in my life. I've had some desperate moments recently. I think I put in this bulletin, and you guys can fill in the gaps for yourself, but the enemy has come against me and my family and my job and my time and my joy in ways that I never thought possible. And I've been doing this job a long time. And I've been in this marriage, and I've been a dad for a long time. The enemy doesn't like it when we get desperate. But desperation drives us to our dwelling place of prayer. It drives us to our spiritual dwelling place where we grab hold of the Lord and we say, I'm not going to let go until you bless me. Remember Jesus' parable about the woman who continues to go to the ruler over and over. Finally says, woman, I'll just give you what you want, just leave me alone. Fortunately, our God is way better than that unfit ruler. We don't have to do that. But he does want to test us. He does want to know if we'll trust him when we go through disappointment. It's easy to be a Christian the day you get saved. You know that? It's easy to sing There's Power in the Blood the day that you come to meet Jesus. And sometimes we think he's a genie that we've rubbed out of a bottle, and now he's there and everything's going to be perfect. That's what the Sidonian woman thought. The woman of Zarephath thought that now that Elijah's here, nothing's ever going to go wrong for me again. Once God starts moving in our church, nothing could ever go wrong again. Once I accept the pastorship at Calvary Christian Fellowship, life's going to be easy and I'll have no more problems. Once I'm with Jesus in the upper room breaking bread and having wine, life's going to be good. But that's just not the truth. The enemy leaves people alone when they're away from Jesus. When they're outside of the Lord's will, that's when it's easy. Because he's not going to bother you. He's already got you. But you get desperate when he comes after you because you're on the right track. I can tell you there were some people desperate for this church. That's what the Lord showed me as I prayed about this. There were people desperate enough, and they watched their dream for this ministry die, and they felt every disappointment every single time that someone didn't show up that said, I'll see you Sunday. And they went to the dwelling place of prayer and said, Lord, what's happening? God, we're doing everything that we know to do, and yet it keeps falling apart. Anyone ever felt like that?
Amen.
Anyone ever experienced that? I know you have. Because as I prayed for you, as I prayed for our church, that's what the Lord showed me, that there's desperate people ready to see a change, ready to get into a dwelling place of prayer and say, Lord, I'm not going to accept this anymore. You've got to move on our behalf. The widow of Zarephath says, take my son to the upper room, Elijah. I trust you, right? Our fifth D is a dethroning. There's a dethroning that happens. In our life, when we're born, there is a person who is crowned king of our life. The day we're born, the person king over my life was me. I don't know about you, but I'm the type of person who thinks I can solve every problem myself. Who thinks, hey, God, as problems circle me, like I put in this bulletin, like a whack-a-mole, I'll just keep hitting them. Eventually you get encircled by problems and you realize it's not very fun to be the king and Lord of your life. The widow of Zarephath had to come to a point where she realized, I'm at the end. There's nothing left that I can do. My son is dead. But God, you sent me this man. I could go to him. I could trust you. Sure. Take my son into the upper room, into the dwelling place of prayer, into the place where God meets people and intervenes on their behalf. Has anyone ever had to go through a dethroning? Have you ever had to realize, apparently what I'm doing is not working. Apparently me being the king over my own life is not the plan that you had for me. Thank you, Brother William. Right on time. I can tell you some of the disciples had to go through a dethroning. They thought as long as Jesus was right there with them, they could do anything. We talked about in November, Peter getting out of the boat and walking on the water. Incredible. He felt bulletproof, to use modern vernacular. Anyone ever felt bulletproof? You feel like you can do no wrong, and then you come to a point where you sink, and you realize, oh, this wasn't about me at all. Folks, I love my father dearly, but the move of God that happened in this church was because there was a faithful vessel. That name could have been Joe Vance or Joe Schlibbegates or Joe Schmo. It didn't have to be that person. It was someone who was willing to stand in the gap, because in 2000, this church had gotten to about this place, and there were people in the dwelling place of prayer, and they were desperate, and they were begging, God, we want to see a move of God. And I believe that's happened again. That's what moves God, trusting Him, taking ourselves off of the throne and putting Him on the throne. You know who else had to be dethroned here? Not just the widow of Zarephath. Elijah had to be dethroned. You know, Elijah just appears. Some people believe he's a time traveler. Maybe Enoch went walking with the Lord and just showed up in Tishbe here in 1 Kings chapter 17. I think that's a pretty good theory, because he has no lineage. Every other person in Scripture, you come from this person and so begat such, and you get a long chapter from Adam to whomever. But with Elijah, he just shows up. And he shows up with power. Hey, it's not going to rain here for the next 3.5 years. You want to continue to blaspheme God and have your false idols all over Israel? Well, sure. Do it without any water or any food. That's what's going to happen next. And then God had sustained him. Elijah had gone down to the brook, and the Lord said, I'm going to have ravens prepare meat for you and feed you. I don't know if you know this, but if you ever try to fight a raven for some meat, you're going to lose. They don't like to give up their portion. But for some reason, God had used those ravens to give meat to Elijah. Life had been pretty good. Elijah was probably starting to think, it's nice being the king. Then he says, go find this widow of Zarephath. Go walk from the Jordan River all the way up to Sidon and meet this Gentile woman. And there, I'm just going to keep feeding you in the middle of the drought. But when he got into the upper room, Elijah had to realize something. God, this isn't about me. There is absolutely nothing I can do. This is all happening in your will. I'm not the king of this situation. You are. The disciples, when Jesus died, had to come to the realization that they were nobody and he was everything, and without him, they could go no further. So when he came back and said, I want you to go back to that same upper room and just wait. Because at some point I'm going to give you something, and then we're going to get started again. But you got to wait. Everybody in this story had a decision to make. They could either go back to being fishermen, which they tried, foolishly. Didn't work out. She could go back to where she was when Elijah found her and just said, Lord, I give up. I'm going to have my last meal and I'll lay here and die. Elijah could have just gone back to the brook. Hey, Lord, apparently I missed my assignment. I got to go back. Maybe you have something else for me. Every one of them was willing to get off of their throne and off of their high horse that we get on sometimes, thinking, life's good because of me. I can tell you in my 38 years what I've learned is life gets bad because of me. It gets good when I give it back to God. I have to get off the throne. The widow of Zarephath had to get off of the throne and put God on the throne. Elijah had to get off the throne and put God on the throne. The disciples had to get off of their throne and put Christ back on the throne. There's a dethroning that happens when we go to the upper room, because that's the place where we get out of the way and we let God come into our situation. And we announce that He's the King. He's the King over this church. He's the King over my marriage. He's the King over my children. One of the things that I didn't put out in this blurb is the first day that Boone was born, he looked perfect. And Kevin and I kept thinking, man, he doesn't even cry. Like, they keep pricking his feet and they draw a little bit of blood and I go, wah. He just rolls right back over and goes to sleep. Like, when they pricked Lucy's feet, I thought she was going to get up day one and start fist fighting. I mean, I'll warn you with that one. She's got a head like a bowling ball and she is not afraid to use it. And then they were going through all their tests that they have to do, just checking the boxes so we could get out of there. And Kayla and I just sort of took for granted, like, we've had 3 perfect children. God has blessed us incredibly. And her recovery is almost supernatural. I'm like, so you had major surgery and they're giving you Tylenol every 6 hours. And you're up like walking the floors and holding the baby and shaking like, better you than me, huh? Your prayer life might be a little better than mine. And then they came in to do the hearing test. And within a couple of seconds, they put the little thing on his right ear. And she goes, well, right ear tests out. He can hear perfectly fine. And then they put it on his left ear. And we waited. And we waited. 15 minutes have gone. And we just kind of walked in the other room awkwardly. And I looked over and I saw her, like, trying not to make eye contact with us. She's shaking him. And after 30 minutes, she finally gave up, and I could tell she didn't want to say the news that we both already knew. She said, he's not getting anything in his left ear. And she said, I'm so sorry. It could be anything. I mean, it could be fluid in the ear. Sometimes as they pass through the birth canal, anything could happen. And I didn't want to react because I thought, God, there's nothing I can do for him. As long as he can hear your voice, we'll put it in your hands. If he never hears out of that left ear, so what? Beethoven couldn't hear, and he wrote beautiful symphonies. God will just accept your will. And I thought, no. God, there is nothing I can do, but I can pray. I can get desperate. I can stop taking this for granted, and I can get in the place that you've called me. I can go to my dwelling place of prayer, and I can say, Lord, I believe that you birthed this child perfect, that he was authored in your mind, that he was created in your imagination. And like you said to Jeremiah, you know the number of hairs on his head, and you've called him and ordained him for such a time as this, that he's coming to a kingdom for a good work. And I can tell you, a new lady came in the next day, and I said, I think we're going to have a good day. She put it on his right ear again. She goes, well, that right ear, man. She goes, now is the left one having problems? I said, yeah. And she barely got it on his left ear, and she looked and kind of grinned, and she goes, well, left ear's working fine today, Dad. And that had absolutely nothing to do with Kayla and I. We couldn't sit on the throne and that baby's ears start hearing. But there is one who causes blind eyes to see and deaf ears to hear. But sometimes he wants us to get intimate and go to that dwelling place of prayer and say, God, I don't know what to do. Elijah had to say, I'm in the upper room now, Lord, and I don't know what to do. I don't know why this has happened, but I know you. The widow of Zarephath wasn't even an Israelite. She was a Sidonian. She was a Gentile. She was an outcast. Elijah should have not even been in her presence, and yet she was willing to say, take my son. Take my son and let's see what happens. The disciples could have done anything, but they got humble and they listened to Jesus and they said, okay, you called us to go out and make disciples of all the earth, but we don't know how to do that. We're not our own king. We have to get off the throne, and we're willing to sit in this upper room and wait for your direction. I want to start by reading Acts chapter 2 really quick. Acts chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. It'll go on to say that they saw flaming tongues of fire, and they could hear, and everyone in their own language, and they couldn't understand what was going on, and 3,000 were converted to the kingdom that day. Because in the upper room, that's the place where God breathes new life. I want to go back to 1 Kings chapter 17. It says, give me your son, Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on the bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, if you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die. Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. and he lived. Here's the word of the Lord today. There's been someone in this house that's been desperate, and they've watched their dream for this church die. And they've been so disappointed, and they've gotten off the throne, and they've gotten into the dwelling place, and God is saying to you today, this is the day the Lord has made. I'm breathing new life into this church. I'm breathing new life into your situation. This is the day I'm going to do a new thing in Wycliffe, Kentucky. And we're going to go out and we're going to reach this community for God, because that's what I've ordained for this time. Because I've called you and 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 you to the kingdom for such a time as this. Amen. That's what the Lord said. He said there's been people that have been praying for nearly 20 years. They've been praying saying, God, I don't know why you've let this die on our watch. We feel like we've done everything you've called us to do. And he said, I know. But I had to get you close. And you had to get intimate. And you had to walk in faith a little bit. Because I'm about to breathe new life. And you had to be ready. Because I'm going to call each and every one of you to do a new thing. We're going to be doing something different than we were doing before. Because you were willing, instead of turning your back on the thing that I've called you to do, you were willing to hold fast. You were willing to make me king. You were willing to believe when it seemed like there was nothing to believe in. And now we're going to do a new thing. We're going to do a new thing in your life. We're going to do a new thing in your marriage. We're going to do a new thing with your children. We're going to do a new thing in this community. And we're going to begin to see people that we've never seen before. People that have never been in these pews. And you know what? We're going to see people who attended this church when they were little children, maybe in the late 80s and early 90s, and they're not even going to know why they're walking back into this building. But they're going to walk back in because God is doing a new thing, because He breathes new life when we're willing to go into the dwelling place of prayer. Someone in this church has been in the upper room praying, and God is answering your prayer today. Hallelujah. Amen. I believe that's the word that the Lord showed me. There's work left to do, and you know there's work left to do, and you've been desperate saying, God, you showed me there was going to be a move of God. And He said, I'm about to start moving. I'm about to start moving because time is short, and the world is dark. And revival is going to start to take place across this nation. You know, we believe that this wokeness, that this leftist agenda, that this globalism, that all of these crazy things that we never believed would be going on 20 years ago. We believe that these are the evils that are going to ruin this country. And I can tell you, it's going to be, in fact, exactly the opposite. Because all of this crazy nonsense is going to lead people back to their knees in prayer. And people across this country are going to be able to get into the dwelling place, and they're going to get alone with God, and they're going to get desperate and say, I don't understand what's going on. When I don't know what to do, 2 Chronicles chapter 20, when the horde is surrounding me and I don't know what to do, I'm going to put my eyes and my faith and my trust in you, Lord. And I believe we're going to see revival across this land, and I believe Calvary Christian Fellowship Church is going to be a part of that revival. I believe that's what the Lord is saying to us today. I'm so thankful to be here among you to be a part of that, because there's work to do. Because in 2005, God gave me a dream about Wycliffe, Kentucky. What you don't know is in 2017, I was praying. Someone had told me that Galen had reached out to my father and said, oh, we're down, Brother Joe, we're so down. And I started to pray, and I saw the Lord showed me a church at Wycliffe. And it wasn't just Calvary Christian Fellowship Church. It was church. It was the church. It was the hands and feet of Christ in this community, putting away their doctrine and their dogma and getting out of their denominationalism and getting a hold of the gospel of Jesus Christ and saying, it doesn't matter if we're Baptist or Catholic or Pentecostal or non-denominational or Church of Christ. We want to see the gospel move in people's lives. We want Jesus Christ to be real in Wycliffe, Kentucky. And I believe today is the beginning of that day. Amen. I believe we're going to see a church at Wycliffe, Kentucky. As we close, I told you I'd be fairly brief today. I'm not. There's no clock. Well, there is a clock, but I can't read it. It's in Roman numerals. Why? Why did God take them into the upper room? Why did the widow's son die only for God to raise him from the dead? Why did Jesus have to die and go away? Why did the disciples have to wait in the upper room? Why do things die in our lives? Why do we go through disappointments? Why do we have to get into this spiritual dwelling place of prayer? For the widow, this is how she ends this chapter. She says, "Now I know that you're a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is true." How did she not know it before? God had already spoken to her. He'd already delivered on what he said. Elijah had already showed up, and she had been eating good with no flour and no oil. But somehow they were having birthday cake every single day. Maybe she thought she believed it before. But going through this process of the disappointment and the death and the desperation and the dethroning and getting into the dwelling place and God delivering on his promise and him breathing new life, now she knew it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Now this Gentile woman was no longer outside of the economy of God. She was right in the middle of it. For I believe that day she and her son weren't just saved physically. They were saved to eternity for forever and ever and ever. What about Elijah? We talked about how good Elijah had. God had protected him and spared him and given him power and shown him mighty and wonderful things. Elijah had more work to do. We talked about this a couple of months ago. Elijah, when he left this widow of Zarephath, was about to go and do something maybe even more improbable and impossible than he had been doing before. He was about to go and call out all of the idolatry of Israel and have a showdown on Mount Carmel. And they were going to have 450 prophets of Baal. And Elijah's charge was to douse a sacrifice with water that I don't believe they even had. They were in the middle of a drought. But somehow they had the water to douse the sacrifice. Somehow they found the water to douse the sacrifice, and Elijah was going to call fire from heaven. And he was going to get rid of all of the idolatry that had been going on for decades, maybe even centuries in Israel. Elijah had to go through this process too, because when he showed up, he thought, hey, okay, God, I see what's happening here. You're going to give me the flour and the oil, and we're going to have cake, and we're going to eat good even when there's nothing else to eat in all of the land. But Elijah had to have a faith builder. He had to be ready for that moment. And so when he went into the upper room, God showed him a new thing. He said, Elijah, I'm going to work my life through you, and you're going to generate new life. I can tell you, once Elijah saw the life come back into that boy, there wasn't a prophet of Baal or 800 prophets of Baal that could have scared him off of Mount Carmel. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt when he prayed and said, call fire down on this sacrifice, that it was going to happen. But he had to get into the upper room. In Acts chapter 2, the disciples felt mighty rushing wind violently shaking the house. There was no doubt this Holy Spirit that Jesus had been promising them. He said, I must go so that one can come that wasn't bound. You know, Jesus was a man. He was God in the flesh, but he was bound to one body. He'd never traveled more than 200 miles. Well, guess what? From that moment, the Spirit of God and that mighty rushing wind went from Jerusalem, and it's made its way all the way to Wycliffe, Kentucky, and it's made its way all the way to Beijing, China, and it's made its way all the way to Sydney, Australia, and it's made its way all the way to Alaska, because the Holy Spirit isn't bound to a body. It flows through each and every one of us. And they had to wait on it because the mission wasn't to spread the gospel throughout Jerusalem. It was to spread the gospel to every single corner of the earth. The Bible has now been translated into something like 150 languages. But they had to get into the dwelling place of prayer. They had to get desperate for it. And they had to say, God, we're ready for you to do a new thing. What are you believing for today? What have you watched die in your life? What disappointments do you have today? Have they driven you away from God? Have you given up hope? Okay, Lord, that thing's dead. Now it's time to move on, do something different. No, I look around and I see people who didn't do that. I believe we're an intimate group today for a reason, because I believe this was a message to people who faced disappointment and saw death. And they got desperate and decided, Lord, I'm going to follow you, and there's no going back for me. I believe there's people in this room who have been in the upper room, in the spiritual dwelling place of prayer, and I believe the word of the Lord is, come on, I'm about to breathe new life into the thing you've been praying for. I'm about to breathe new life into your marriage, into your loved ones that you've been praying for, into your family, into your community, into your job, into your children. I'm going to breathe new life into this church because this is the time. And you had to go through that process, and you had to get close to me, and you had to trust me. But I'm ready to do a new thing. Stand with me. As we close, when Lynn's going to come, I hope you all didn't feel like I was being irreverent as we were worshiping this morning. I just was submitted in prayer. You know, you get nervous sometimes. Lord, speak your word. And when I was a kid, my dad would do this sometimes, and I hated it so much. And I thought, Dad, why are you doing that? And I thought the Lord said to me today, as Lynn plays softly, I don't want just one person to come and pray. I don't want just one person to feel like I need to get into that upper room. I want everybody there. And so what I'm asking is, Lynn plays softly, if you would, I think I want to start off my first Sunday as pastor, having each and every one of you come forward, and I'd like us to join hands and pray. Because that's what's going to change this church. We can do anything that we want to do. We can have any Sunday school program or Wednesday night program. We can have new scent air in the lobby. We can paint the outside of the building. But the word of the Lord is, unless the Lord build a house, they labor in vain. It's not going to take the work of man. It's going to take the Spirit of God breathing new life into this place.